Previously, in Episode 2, the Grand Jury meets the fires of World Trade Center 7, the deception of NIST. We, attorney Mick Harrison of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry and myself, introduced you to the catastrophic destruction of the World Trade Center Building 7 at 5:20 p.m. on 9/11/2001. We showed the few small and scattered fires in the building and the official representation by NIST's Shyam Sunder that they were the cause of the complete destruction of this skyscraper. We also witnessed the startling testimony of firefighting textbook author Captain Raul Angulo, pointing out how firefighting strategy and tactics have not changed at all following the 2008 NIST report on this building's unprecedented collapse, along with some key points of evidence by other experts. We invited you also to be a part of this historic mission, justice on behalf of the 9/11 victims and their family members. And we showed you how to participate in a number of ways, including as a virtual grand juror. Now, in Episode 3, via our presentation to our stand-in virtual grand jurors, we provide new forensic evidence, eyewitness, and expert testimony to the actual grand jurors, which will be reformatted specifically for them. We'll explore the various causes of building destruction in an intense effort to determine what really could have brought down this mammoth skyscraper suddenly, smoothly, symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds, and what could not have brought it down. Now, Episode 3. If fire did not bring down World Trade Center 7, as we were told by our government, then we should probably examine some other types of destructive forces that might provide some clarity.
Let's have a look at some buildings that have collapsed due to natural causes, in this case earthquakes. We have a building that's certainly damaged, but recognizable as the building after it falls. The columns and the beams are not severed one from another. Concrete is not pulverized to dust. These buildings were destroyed by explosions. We have thick, billowing, enormous, pyroclastic-like smoke clouds with airborne, pulverized solids from the building rapidly expanding in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredible heat from the ignition of the hot gases from the explosions. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. Explosions can be harnessed quite effectively in high-rise buildings to bring them down, as you see in this series of controlled demolitions, just like the old hotels in Las Vegas. There's only a handful of companies that can accomplish this. It's actually quite an intricate process to engineer and place shaped cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building key locations and then detonate them in a very precise order in order to bring the building down, straight down, or to the side if they really want to accomplish that. So there's a set of features associated with such controlled demolitions. What are they? Let's have a look. We have a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. They accomplish this by severing the columns all at once. This results in a near free-fall acceleration straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure beneath, resulting also in the total dismemberment of the structural steel form. With limited damage to adjacent structures, that's one of the goals of controlled demolition. Feature 7, there's patterned explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them. The concrete floors are broken up. They don't want to have to go back and jackhammer concrete floors. They let the explosives do that work. So there's chemical evidence of explosives left behind in the aftermath. These features are direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically, with gradual deformation, following the path of least resistance. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, like government documentation, foreknowledge of the demolition, people know in advance that it's going to happen. With video documentation, it becomes a model of proof using the scientific method.
As you listen to the various pieces of evidence that Richard provides you as grand jurors, for each one you need to ask yourself, is a fire-driven collapse, as NIST asserts, possible given what I just saw here, or given what the scientific analysis proves here? And is this piece of evidence inconsistent with the government's theory, and is the only way to explain it use of explosives? You don't need 10 different categories of converging evidence, even though you have it here, to give you reasonable cause to believe that a bombing crime occurred. If you have a piece of scientific evidence that can only be explained by use of explosives, that one line of evidence is sufficient for you to draw the conclusion.
Well, we talked about the features of controlled demolition, but do they apply to Building 7? So we can now apply them to determine if World Trade Center 7 was destroyed by fire, as NIST claimed, or by controlled demolition, as the evidence shows. Let's start with feature number 1. Is there a sudden onset of destruction? Back to Dr. Sumter.
You had a sequence of structural failures that had to take place, and where everything was not instantaneous.
But it was indeed instantaneous. Let's watch from different angles as news anchor Dan Rather from CBS narrates.
And what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Well, this is Dan using his rational resources. We've all seen the old hotels, for instance, in Las Vegas, but we didn't hear Dan talk about this after 9/11. No. We didn't see this building, in fact, come down on TV, with 2 exceptions, after 9/11. It's as if it's been swept under the rug.
So, Richard, the point that you make about the video of the collapse of the buildings reflecting the classic characteristics of a controlled demolition, I put that in sort of a layperson way of, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And in this case, if it looks like a controlled demolition, it probably is. And for the benefit of the grand jury, these videos present what might be considered and fairly described as a prima facie case of controlled demolition. So then the question is there evidence to the contrary? And is there evidence actually corroborating their controlled demolition, the use of explosives? And you're going to hear the details of that evidence.
David Chandler exposes NIST as reverse engineering the collapse times and doing a bad job of it.
By NIST's own logic, the building couldn't have been crushing itself down in a natural collapse. To bolster their claim, they made a blatantly erroneous measurement of the collapse of the building, They claimed the building fell 40% slower than FreeFall. They based this on a simple timing between what they claimed was the start of collapse and an ending point 18 floors down. Here's the interval they timed. Keep in mind, each cycle of the little yellow clock represents 1 second. Overall, this time is 5.4 seconds. This measurement is easiest to see if we run it backward in slow motion. Notice when the building actually starts to fall compared to when they started their clock. So, whatever was going on at the point they started their clock, it was not the start of downward motion. The building remained at full height for approximately 1.5 seconds after they started their clock. The problem with this measurement goes beyond just bad timing. The whole idea of free fall time is literally nonsensical, and they knew it. You can't characterize free fall in terms of time. To compare the motion of a building with the acceleration of gravity, you have to measure the acceleration of the building. That means tracking its motion throughout the fall, calculating the velocity at each point, and finding the slope of the velocity versus time graph. The scientists at NIST knew that the acceleration of the building was going to be a problem for their narrative, so it appears that they tried to skirt around the issue by talking about time instead of acceleration. NIST compounded their error by using an invalid equation to compute what they call free fall time. It's an equation from first semester high school physics that's good for what it's good for, but it applies only if you know in advance that the acceleration is uniform and the timing is started precisely at the onset of downward motion. None of this applies in the case of Building 7. Not only did NIST make a false measurement and base it on a false methodology, scientists of the caliber employed by NIST had to know that this entire analysis was false. The question is why unquestionably competent scientists and engineers would knowingly produce such a transparently invalid analysis. NIST's final report, released a few months later in November 2008, had a revised analysis, but they characterized it as supplementing rather than replacing their earlier analysis. They continued to defend the earlier analysis, and they again cited the same equation for free fall time. However, in the final report, NIST divided the collapse into 3 stages. They claim that in the first stage, the time prior to the obvious downward motion we saw a minute ago, the roofline descended slowly as the columns low in the building buckled. What we are seeing is sudden onset simultaneously across the whole width of the building, and NIST's explanation fails to account for it.
But structural engineers can account for it. Here's one of several dozen structural engineers signed on to the public petition demanding a new investigation.
My name is Kamal Obeid, a licensed structural engineer in California for about 35 years. And my work included design and analysis of steel frame buildings. It's one of my specialties, actually. The only way that could happen is that you would have to sever multiple columns, in fact, all the columns along the floors at the lower levels of the building at the same time in order for the building to collapse the way it did.
Maybe we can learn why by listening to yet another of those exceptional structural engineers. In this case, Steve Dusterwald from Las Vegas, Nevada.
The simultaneous failure of all columns at each level cannot be produced by an organic event like a fire. The columns at each level were of varying sizes, carrying various loads, and suffering various amounts of structural distress. Yet all of these columns, despite the variables, all failed simultaneously at the same instant. Failing simultaneously is an impossible event. It's an impossibility. Scattered fires would only affect those areas. And after the fire burned out, it would move to other areas, so there would be no long-lasting, high-temperature source from natural office fires. Organic processes like fire do not work on split-second timing. You cannot have microsecond timing precision with an organic natural event like a fire. Controlled demolition is the only theory that explains all the evidence.
Feature number 2 of controlled demolition. Is there a straight-down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Let's hear from NIST and Dr. Sunder.
This question comes from Mindy Kleinberg, also of the September 11th Advocates. If column 79 collapsed and then 80 and 81, all of which were on the same side, why wasn't the collapse asymmetrical?
Well, keep in mind that the only view you had of the building that was any clear and visible and where you could actually make out what was happening were from the north of the building.
This is the overall collapse. It's straight down and symmetrical. The center of the pile is in the center of the building's original footprint. It falls like a house of cards. This is what they typically do in controlled demolition. An unevenly damaged building would fall over. How do we make sense of this? We're being asked to suspend our critical faculties and believe that these small, randomly placed fires brought this building down symmetrically. All we have to do is think about it. In order to bring the building down symmetrically, they have to find a way to remove all of the interior column supports, followed a second or so later by the exterior columns. This doesn't happen by accident in office fires. But these fires did that damage? Did they have that level of precision? Any deviation from that pattern, and the building will begin to fall over. This is quite a science they use to bring buildings down.
So one observation, if you watch these videos of the collapse of Building 7, it's really very uniform, very symmetric. I can tell you as a former math teacher that there's a lot of symmetry there. You don't get, as Richard no doubt will tell you, a symmetric collapse from asymmetric damage, either from fires or impact from debris. So you would expect for NIST to be able to explain this, that fire actually caused this collapse, that they would have some way of explaining scientifically through computer modeling, applying principles of science and actual data to support their conclusion.
The symmetry is the smoking gun. NIST says that the failure occurred at column 79 on level 12. This means basically that they're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in the total collapse of a building. It just doesn't make any sense.
There's an old saying, I think from Carl Sagan, well-known scientist, that an extraordinary conclusion or opinion requires extraordinary evidence. And NIST is basically asserting something extraordinary, that a symmetrical collapse happened from asymmetrical damage doesn't meet the Carl Sagan standard.
Well, how is such symmetrical destruction accomplished? Let's look at feature number 3, the patterned removal of column supports, and learn from explosives loader Tom Sullivan, who worked for Controlled Demolition, Inc., the premier implosion company in the world.
You basically have to take it apart with explosives. I was a loader and also a photographer. I'd walk around with my camera bag, and if I saw something good, I would take a picture and then get back to work. Shape charges are used on the faces of those I-beams we cut the web out of. They will be put against those faces at a certain standoff and will be initialized when the blast comes. They are there to cut the faces. And they will cut that I-beam like butter. Those charges are set with delays of hundredths of a second difference from one another. And that is the art of implosion, because you have to know how to create a demolition wave so the building essentially doesn't jam up on itself. And that's happened rarely. We take a lot of the strength away of that I-beam, leaving only the faces. You don't want a lot of collateral damage around the neighborhood either. Then the impulse is set, and you hear a rapid succession of explosives. You're going to start hearing a deep-throated rumble as those big charges start going off. And within a second or two, that building starts to move down, and moments later, it's on the ground. And it takes, I can't emphasize this enough, it takes an extraordinary amount of control and precision to make this happen. What you're looking at is controlled demolition. The problem with the story of NIST, the problem with the narrative, is that this is perfect. You can't ask for a more perfect implosion than what you're viewing here. And that doesn't happen without precision and somebody doing it. An office fire is not capable, even if it was physically capable, it's not capable of doing it to that degree of that precision to get this. I mean, this is perfect.
Let's compare the collapse of Building 7 to a series of known controlled demolitions. Is there any similarity? Is there enough to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper and should therefore require extraordinary evidence, because it's an extraordinary hypothesis that they're claiming. The controlled demolition hypothesis probably should have been the first, if not the only, rational hypothesis put forward. But no, it was relegated to a series of very frequently asked questions of NIST, such as question 13 about controlled demolition. We'll hear Dr. Sunder's answer to this ubiquitous question in a few moments. Is the speed of the collapse relevant? Well, NIST certainly thought that it was. They went to great lengths to hide it. Dr. Sunder clearly explained why freefall for World Trade Center 7 was impossible.
The analysis showed there's a difference in time between a free fall time. A free fall time would be an object that has no structural components below it.
But this object, the building, did have structural components below it.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
Dr. Sunder acknowledges the structure, and so must also then acknowledge the time and energy required for its failure before and during the collapse.
There was a structural resistance that was provided in this particular case.
He is arguing that freefall could not have happened in the case of a building crushing itself down. And he was right. The problem is freefall did happen, and our measurements clearly show it did. Therefore, by NIST's own logic, the building couldn't have been crushing itself down in a natural collapse.
NIST was challenged publicly in their own technical briefing by concerned citizens, who admitted this question in writing.
Question was, why did we report descent speed rather than acceleration?
We computed the time that it takes to drop the roughly 18 stories that were in view. We also provided a calculation based on the distance from the top of the parapet to the lowest point visible to compare that with the free fall speed.
Can you clarify that?
I think it's something that we need to clarify and correct in the final version of the report.
Okay.
Sure.
That probably needs fixing.
And they did correct it in their final report, where they were forced to acknowledge that the building came down at free fall for at least a third of its 7-second fall. What they did not do is acknowledge the black and white contradictions of free fall.
So I measured it. If you plot the velocity of the roofline versus time, the slope of the graph gives the acceleration at any time during the fall. It does in fact fall precisely at free fall for 2.5 seconds. while maintaining a level roofline even as it falls. This indicates that the support was completely and suddenly removed over a vertical extent of about 8 stories across the whole width of the building. Freefall is motion under the influence of gravity alone. It implies zero resistance. This is freefall. Basically, I remove all forces except gravity, and what you then have is freefall. In freefall, all the potential energy of an elevated mass is used to generate the downward speed, with no energy left over to do any other work. It can't crush anything, break anything, or throw things around. Any interaction with other objects would slow the fall. Therefore, a free-falling building could not possibly be crushing what was under it. The clear implication is the building was being demolished, and the top section of the building was not crushing what was under it, but falling in response to underlying support being removed.
So what we've got here is a ductile structural steel building that is designed to withstand significant wind loads and significant loads that are 3 to 4, even 10 times larger than the actual load. It is not possible for a local failure to cause the building to collapse like a house of cards at free fall speed perfectly into its footprint. That is an impossibility. You would literally have to sever all the columns on multiple floors simultaneously or near simultaneously to have a collapse that is at free fall speed that looks like a controlled demolition. So we should call it as it is. It's a controlled demolition collapse, and that's what the forensic evidence shows.
There are 2 regions in the overstress of a column. There is the elastic overstress, and then there's the plastic overstress. In the elastic range, a load placed on the column would cause the column to deflect, and removal of the load would bring the column back to its original position. If the stress is higher than the yield point, the steel just stretches like taffy with no increase in load. Steel columns that buckle due to a long distance between lateral supports still retain some percentage of their design strength. The capacity of these members is reduced by long unsupported lengths between lateral supports, but they always have some capacity. Somewhere in the area of 20–25% remains even after plastic damage. It never has zero capacity, because that would be the same as the steel being made out of air. All of these properties were circumvented by the methods used to destroy the building. There was no elastic deformation, there was no plastic deformation, there was simply collapse at free fall velocity.
Which means that not one of those 80 columns on each floor gave any resistance during at least a third of this building's 7-second collapse.
So the issue of free fall is an example of a point I made earlier. When you as grand jury members are hearing about government conduct, including suspicious conduct, you need to ask yourself, does this government conduct have any significance for the question, the evidentiary question, that we're trying to answer? In this case, does the efforts by NIST and government officials to conceal evidence of use of explosives, or ignore that evidence, or misrepresent that evidence, does that have any significance for the task you have here today? And ultimately, you have to answer that question for yourself. But my question for you is, when you do that, if there was no use of explosives at the Trade Center on 9/11, what motive would these government officials have to cover up that evidence?
Let's look at feature number 5, the total dismemberment of the structure.
Even if a floor were to collapse, it still wouldn't be able to collapse all of the connections simultaneously.
In fact, the structural steel codes had been designed specifically throughout the years to build in ductility into structural steel frames. And that's why you build high-rise buildings with structural steel, because you need the benefit of that ductility to allow the building to basically be resilient and not fail brittly. You twist and bend, but you don't break the connections. If you fail the interior of the building, this is what you get. You get the crumpling, which is what you saw in the animation that even NIST developed. So they've basically debunked their own story.
Let's learn how these beams and columns are connected with Highrise Architect Richard Wallace.
Members of the grand jury, the laws of man are changed from time to time to suit our needs or our preferences. The laws of nature, on the other hand, never change. I'm an architect, a member of the AIA. I have a Master of Architecture and Urban Design from Washington University in St. Louis. I was hired by Perkins & Will to work on the Standard Oil building in Chicago, an 83-story steel-framed high-rise. My work on the Standard Oil building and other high-rise buildings in Chicago gave me extensive knowledge on the science of high-rise buildings. There are many aspects about the NIST report on World Trade Center Building 7 that do not conform to the laws of nature and the science of buildings. NIST's explanation of the events concerning Building 7 would be laughable if it were not so deadly serious. The NIST hypothesis is simply not sufficient, and it's not achievable, and it certainly is not acceptable. The weight of the building was carried by the horizontal beams, which transferred the heavy loads to vertical columns. There were 81 columns. Every horizontal beam was connected to every vertical column, secured by a series of structural steel bolts that hold these beams and columns together. The intended function of high-strength steel bolts is to resist against forces that would otherwise disassemble and break down the structure. This is how steel-framed high-rise buildings are designed and built, and this is why these structures do not fail. All of these bolts and beam-to-column connections acting collectively ensures that the entire building is firmly interlocked. Building 7 is a 47-story structure with 81 steel columns on each floor, totaling 3,807 columns. A typical column could have 4 beam-to-column connections. Exterior columns had only 3 connections. Multiplying 3.5 times 3,807 columns comes to 13,324 beam-to-column connections, on average of 30 bolts per connection. 30 bolts times 13,325 connections comes to 399,000 the estimated bolts in Building 7. This is an approximation, but it demonstrates the massive number of bolts and beam-to-column connections that were required to construct Building 7. There were hundreds of thousands of high-strength steel bolts attaching thousands of beam-to-column connections, guaranteeing that Building 7 would not fall. It is a fact that historically there has never been a high-rise steel building that failed due to fire, and certainly not to simple office fires or to the fabricated idea that thermal expansion could take down a steel structure. It has never happened, ever. NIST proposes that this single beam was pushed off its seat on column 79, breaking free of its bolted connections, causing hundreds of thousands of steel bolts throughout the building to fail, detaching thousands of steel beam-to-column connections, thereby releasing all the floors to fail immediately throughout the entire building in order to accomplish the building's actual free fall acceleration. This entire narrative is physically impossible. In order to accomplish the actual collapse of Building 7 in free fall, it would necessitate zero shear resistance and zero tension force from each of these hundreds of thousands of bolts and their beam-to-column connections. This could certainly be accomplished in a fraudulent computer simulation, but in the real world, it would require the use of precise timing explosions at key points throughout the building. Nothing else could accomplish the dismantling of Building 7. The NIST report is irresponsible and not viable because it is a conflict with the laws of nature and the science of high-rise buildings. The NIST report is an inadequate proposal that could be expected from the media, but not from professionals in the building industry. It is unacceptable and an insult to the intelligence of those of us who design and build high-rise buildings. Worse yet, they disregarded the opinions and experience of over 3,600 architects and engineers who have signed the public petition demanding a new investigation into World Trade Center 7. The evidence is clear-cut that NIST rejected eyewitness testimony of bombs and explosions occurring in Building 7, and they embellished on the severity of office fires in order to support their false premise. Members of the grand jury, I encourage an independent investigation into World Trade Center Building 7.
Architectural engineer Ross Muir, who focused on structural and lighting engineering in his career, degreed at the University of Colorado Boulder, provides another perspective on the redundancy of those thousands of column-to-beam connections in this mammoth building.
World Trade Center 7 could not have come down at free fall the way it did unless there was another element other than fire damage going on with the frame, and that would be a uniform failure of columns across different floor levels in a non-random way, in a completely calculated and strategic and focused way. All the columns on one floor, and below it, all the columns on another floor, thereby removing the entire frame of the building simultaneously. Because simply there would be random failures, and the frame would give up in one part and then in another part over time, slowly, and the flame would begin to topple. Steel frames in general, they're analyzed by computers where you analyze the node of the frame. And a node of a frame is simply, in a high-rise, it's simply where the floor beams, the primary floor beams, come into contact and transfer their load, their weight, to the column. Anywhere that happens is called a node. What you do when you design that node is you calculate all the inputs that are coming into it that you expect. Can be some dynamic inputs, but with steel frame high-rises, they're so heavy that most of the analysis is static analysis. You don't want that node moving in any way. They're all designed to be static, and they all have different inputs. The nodes at the top have more wind load input, and at the bottom they have more dead load and weight on them, which is why their columns towards the bottom are heavier and more robust than they are towards the top of the building. Whereas the floor beams may all be the same throughout the height of the building or the frame. Basically, those nodes are, in the end, after you put your safety factor in there, which is going to be between 2, 3, and 4. In the case of World Trade Center 7, you've got 4,000 plus nodes. It's a pretty simple calculation. It's the amount of columns you have in the floor multiplied by the number of floors you have. You can make a mistake and the frame is still going to behave as a static frame, each node, not moving anywhere. The NIST report says that it was basically column 79, one column given out in a few floors, but you are not going to lose the entire building all in a very short period of time based on a few nodes collapsing out of 4,001. Basically, what I'm seeing is at least 160 nodes being completely eliminated, and this is for the building to go into FreeFall, which it did. It went straight down the roof line, basically straight down through the footprint of all the structure below it, without any torsion, without any angular momentum. The interior core in a demolition usually is a few seconds or a second or two ahead of the exterior or perimeter structure part of the frame, perimeter nodes. Interior nodes, where the elevator core is, generally are eliminated first, and this is for that to pull on the exterior floor beams, primary beams that are still intact, so that the building is not going to be inclined, if there is any timing issues, to tip. It's going to want to go straight down through its path of most resistance, what used to be its path of most resistance. The frame is going to provide quite a bit more resistance. It's so much resistance that it's going to arrest any kind of collapse when you're talking about 160 nodes even in a 4,000 node frame, unless of course they go into the eliminated to where you're going to have no frame in existence. And if you do, it's going to be very much longer than what we saw that day. The steel can get very hot and it only loses 50% of its strength. That fireproofing on the steel is keeping the steel from getting too hot. So if I've designed my nodes in that frame to only resist with a factor of 2, safety factor of 2, I might be getting into trouble. But again, where are you going to use a safety factor of 3 or 4? You're not going anywhere still. Now, if it gets to be a very hot fire, which there wasn't anything that I'm aware of that could make it that hot in a building because of the codes and because of the wet nature of the fire, that steel is never going to be getting less than 50% of its strength. I have seen steel frames be subjected to fires that do cause them to lose more than 50% of their strength, or they were designed in such a way that they had a sufficient safety factor, and they do deform. Well, what happens then? They may not fail. In fact, they don't fail. They just deform. It's not going to give up the frame, though. What it's going to do is cause that frame to be unrepairable. So that's why you have the fireproofing. It's because the building is going to come down at free fall. It's because you don't want to have a building you cannot repair. The frame is ruined by a fire. America has given up its scientific responsibility to the world. I think there's a lack of trust in government, science, and in America, frankly, based on the fact the rest of the world knows it can't trust us when we come and we analyze the structure and we say, well, steel does this and it does that, like it did on 9/11. It's really not believable from a scientific standpoint. We're pulling the world back, trying to get people to undo their scientific process and believe in the authority of what is said rather than on testing and experiment and actual scientific process. We tell the truth about our science, and if we're wrong, we admit it. And if we're right, you're going to believe it. So I believe we're wrong on World Trade Center 7.
Feature number 5. The building appears to have been completely dismembered. It has fallen like a house of cards. It seems that every column is severed from the ones above and below and from every beam attached to it. Remember, in buildings that collapse naturally, they are certainly badly damaged. However, the columns and beams are not severed one from another.
We have a question here, members of the grand jury. It's a scientific question. Is it possible to have a steel frame building completely dismembered without the use of explosives. You're going to hear more testimony about this and judge it for yourselves. But it's one of those questions where you have to consider this principle. When you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains must be the truth.
Feature number 6. Was there limited damage to adjacent structures? That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. There is surprisingly little damage, given that a 47-story building just collapsed across the street. The Verizon building and the post office sustained some damage, but the center of the pile is in the center of the building's footprint.
Another example of, is there any way to explain this without use of explosives? Any controlled demolition expert that does this work commercially will tell you that it's essentially a work of art by them to design their placement of explosives to minimize damage to surrounding buildings and areas. To get a building to fall into its own footprint is not something that nature does. Humans have to design that.
Join us for our next episode, number 4, NIST's Building 7 Collapse Initiation Theory and their computer modeling, a Potemkin village, where we take a much closer look at NIST's flawed collapse initiation theory and dismember it piece by piece. We also explore the numerous fatal problems in their computer modeling of the collapse of Building 7. Then we introduce and compare the alternate 2019 4-year computer modeling study from the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, looking deep into the work of the chair of its civil engineering department, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, Professor Leroy Halsey. All, of course, with striking legal commentary for the grand jury from Mick Harrison, litigation director for the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. So don't miss episode number 4. We want to hear from you. We don't want you to just watch 9/11 crime scene to courtroom. We're inviting you to serve as virtual grand jurors during each episode. And we're encouraging you to judge the evidence as if you were yourself a grand juror. And you can provide us your individual assessment of the veracity of the evidence and the eyewitness testimony. And give us your feedback on our website, 911crimescenetocourtroom.org, or simpler, 911c2c.org. We can incorporate changes and improvements provided by you in the upcoming series. Then join us for an online conference call immediately following the release of each episode. Don't worry, we'll remind you when you add your email to the C2C release reminder list. Here's more that you can do on the 911c2c.org website. Share evidence and investigative strategies with the team. Suggest potential witnesses for the grand jurors to question. Put potential witnesses and whistleblowers in contact with our team. And of course, donate to the 911 C2C effort. Actually, these initial C2C episodes are more of a beginning than an end. Until 911 transparency and accountability are achieved, our investigation will be ongoing. It's all on the website, 911crimescene2courtroom.org, or simpler, again, 911c2c.org.